So the rain came down like shards of glass, slicing through the dusk, as if it too was done pretending. I stood at the edge of my perfect suburban life, mascara streaked with truth, heels sinking into betrayal, staring at the bedroom window where my husband laughed with the woman who wasn't me. 12 years of obedience, shattered in a heartbeat. And in that thunderous silence, I heard the one thing I hadn't heard in years. My own voice. If there were awards for best performance by a husband caught red-handed, Marcus would have swept every category. His carefully rehearsed calm shattered the second he saw what I held. His jaw clenching like a vice as his world unraveled under the soft glow of the restaurant's chandeliers. I still remember exactly how the rain felt against my face that night, cold and sharp like tiny needles pricking my skin. Or maybe that was just how everything felt when your entire world collapses around you. Sorry, I promised myself. I wouldn't get emotional telling this story, but some wounds leave scars that remind you of their existence. Even years later, my name is Allison. 3 years ago, I was approaching my 12th wedding anniversary with Marcus, my college sweetheart turned husband. From the outside, we had the picture-perfect life. A charming colonial house in the suburbs of Denver, respectable careers, he in investment banking, me in nonprofit management, and a social circle that many would envy. What people didn't see were the cracks that had been forming since year 3, hairline fractures that grew wider with each passing year. I met Marcus during my sophomore year at the University of Chicago. He was charismatic, ambitious, and when he focused his attention on you, it felt like being bathed in sunlight. That feeling, that warmth, was what I chased for 12 years, not realizing that what had started as occasional cloudiness had turned into a perpetual winter. God, I sound so poetic now, but back then I couldn't even articulate what was happening to me. Allison, did you remember to call the landscaper about the backyard? Marcus's voice always had this way of sounding both casual and demanding simultaneously. It was a Tuesday evening, and I had just finished a 12-hour shift at the outreach clinic, dealing with a system-wide server crash that affected patient data. I'm sorry, I had an emergency at work. I'll call first thing tomorrow, I replied, setting my bag down and already feeling the familiar tightness in my chest. The prelude to one of his moods. Marcus sighed dramatically, not looking up from his laptop. I mentioned it 3 days ago. I have the Arlingtons coming over this weekend, and the yard looks like a disaster. You know how important these connections are for my promotion track. I nodded, apologized again, I was always apologizing, and headed to the kitchen to start dinner, even though my feet were screaming from standing all day. That was our pattern. Marcus made requests that sounded like casual mentions, but were actually non-negotiable directives. And I scrambled to meet expectations that were never fully explained until I'd failed to meet them. The control was subtle at first. He'd suggest what I should wear to his firm's events. That navy dress makes you look more professional, sweetheart. Who I should maintain friendships with. Lauren seems like she's going through a lot. Maybe give her some space. How I should advance in my career. Nonprofit management has better hours than direct services, and you'll be happier, trust me. Each suggestion came wrapped in concern, each restriction presented as being for my benefit. And somewhere along the way, the vibrant, opinionated woman I'd been in college began to disappear, replaced by someone who checked her text messages 3 times before sending them, who rehearsed casual conversations in her head before having them, who felt a flutter of panic when the phone rang. There were nights I stood in the darkened kitchen long after he'd gone to bed, staring at my reflection in the window, wondering where the confident, laughing girl I used to be had gone. A hollow ache settled in my chest, a quiet terror that maybe she was gone forever, and the person left behind was just an echo of who I once was. Is the chicken supposed to be this dry? Marcus asked at dinner that same night, cutting into the breast with precise movements. Maybe try that marinade Julia suggested at the 4th of July party. Julia, his firm's office manager. He mentioned her frequently. Her organizational skills, her cooking tips, her fashion sense. I'll try that next time, I said, though I knew the chicken was perfectly moist. I'd stopped trusting my own perceptions years ago. Financial control came next. We maintained separate accounts, but Marcus insisted on managing our investments and major financial decisions. It just makes sense. Allison, I negotiate multi-million-dollar deals for a living. What didn't make sense was why I needed approval for purchases over $200 from my own salary, or why my name wasn't on the deed to our house despite contributing to the mortgage, or why discussions about starting a family kept getting postponed because the timing isn't right financially. When did I first suspect he was having an affair? There were the late nights that became more frequent, the business trips that extended by a day or two, the texts he'd angle away from my view. But suspicion is different from knowledge, and I might have continued in uncertainty if not for that rainy Thursday. When I left work early with a migraine, I wasn't supposed to be home. That's important to understand. In 12 years of marriage, I had never, not once, arrived home unexpectedly. I always texted, always called ahead. Part of me believes I didn't do so that day because, subconsciously, I already knew. The sound reached me first as I closed the front door, a woman's laugh, musical and uninhibited, coming from upstairs. Then a deeper rumble that I recognized as Marcus's genuine laugh, the one I hadn't heard directed at me in years. My body moved on autopilot, shoes still on, purse still clutched in white-knuckled fingers. Up the stairs, Marcus had insisted we recarpet in a light gray that showed every speck of dirt. Our bedroom door was ajar, and through that crack, I saw them, Marcus and Julia, on our bed. The bed I'd made that morning, hospital corners, just the way he preferred. I didn't gasp or cry out. I simply stood there, watching my husband kiss another woman's neck as she threw her head back in pleasure, their naked bodies moving in a rhythm that felt like a mockery of every intimacy he'd withheld from me in recent years. I backed away silently, descended the stairs, and walked straight out the front door. And there, standing in the driveway as the first drops of a spring storm began to fall, I finally allowed myself to cry. Not just for the infidelity I'd just witnessed, but for the 12 years I'd spent slowly erasing myself. But this isn't a story about how I fell apart. This is a story about how I gathered those pieces and rebuilt them into something stronger. Because as I stood there with rain mingling with my tears, an unexpected feeling washed over me. Alongside the hurt and betrayal was relief. Relief, because now I had irrefutable proof that I wasn't crazy, wasn't oversensitive, wasn't imagining the distance. Relief, because after years of not knowing whether I had the right to feel neglected, I finally had something tangible to point to and say, this is wrong. What I did next would change everything, but I didn't know that then, standing in the rain, feeling simultaneously shattered and, strangely, frighteningly free. All I knew was that for the first time in 12 years, I was about to make a decision entirely on my own. I didn't confront Marcus that night, or the next day, or even that week. I returned to my car, drove to a hotel, and checked in with mechanical movements. I called in sick to work the next morning, something I rarely did, and lay in the anonymous hotel bed staring at the ceiling, my mind cycling through 12 years of memories with new context. Marcus called 17 times before I finally answered. Ally, where are you? I've been worried sick. His voice had that perfect note of concern that had fooled me so many times before. I need some space, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. I'm taking a few days off work. I'm safe, but I need time to think. A pause. Think about what? Is this about the landscaper? I called them myself. It's taken care of. The absolute disconnection between his reality and mine almost made me laugh. Almost. It's not about the landscaper, Marcus. It's about us. I'll be home Sunday evening. We can talk then. He tried to press for more information, but I held firm. Another first, and ended the call. Then I texted my colleague, Dana, the only work friend Marcus hadn't subtly pushed out of my life, probably because her blunt personality and single status made her non-threatening in his eyes. Need a massive favor. Can we meet for coffee? Dana didn't ask questions when I showed up at the cafe with puffy eyes and wearing the same clothes as yesterday. She listened as I explained what I'd seen, occasionally muttering profanities that made the couple at the next table glance over disapprovingly. I knew he was controlling, but cheating too? What are you going to do? Please tell me you're leaving him. Was I? The question hung in the air. 12 years is a long time to disentangle. especially when you've been systematically isolated from friends, when your financial independence has been compromised, when your confidence has been eroded to the point where decisions feel overwhelming. I don't know yet, I admitted, but I need somewhere to stay for a few days while I figure it out. Dana immediately offered her spare room. Stay as long as you need. And Allison, you're stronger than you think. I wasn't sure I believed her, but I nodded anyway. The next 3 days were spent in a haze of practical activity that somehow kept the emotional tsunami at bay. I moved like a machine, checking items off a mental list that seemed to grow by the hour. Bank visits, calls to lawyers, small errands I once needed permission for. Beneath every task was the dull ache of disbelief. How had I gotten here? How had my life become a series of secret plans and whispered favors? But every time I reached for my purse to withdraw cash or sign the paperwork with the lawyer, a sick, twisting feeling settled in my stomach. I felt like I was sneaking around, like I was the one betraying him, even though he was the one who had lied and cheated. It didn't matter that I had proof. It didn't matter that he was the one who broke the vows. I had been conditioned to feel guilt for simply acting alone, for taking control of my own life. That's what his years of manipulation had done. Rewired my sense of right and wrong until I couldn't tell whether I was fleeing danger or creating it. I kept glancing over my shoulder, irrationally convinced Marcus would appear out of nowhere, catch me, and strip away the fragile courage I was trying to build. The fear of being discovered made every small task feel dangerous, like I was learning to walk a tightrope without a net. But in the quiet moments, like brushing my teeth in Dana's guest bathroom or lying awake in the unfamiliar bed, the weight of it all crashed over me in waves. I felt terrified and numb at the same time, haunted by memories of every apology I'd made for him, every time I convinced myself things weren't as bad as they felt. I kept replaying our life together, realizing how small I had allowed myself to become, and how far I was from the woman I once believed I could be. I visited an ATM and withdrew the maximum daily amount from my personal account, repeating this process for 3 consecutive days. I contacted a lawyer friend of Dana's who specialized in divorce, explaining my situation in a 2-hour consultation that left me both drained and strangely empowered. Financial abuse is still abuse. Allison, she told me, her eyes kind but firm, there's a clear pattern of psychological control here. We can build a strong case, especially with the infidelity. But first, we need to secure your position. She advised me not to confront Marcus about the affair yet, to gather documentation of our finances, to secure personal items of value, and most importantly, to be careful. Men like your husband don't react well to losing control. The most dangerous time for women in controlling relationships is when they try to leave. Her words sent a chill through me, because I knew she was right. Marcus had never been physically violent, but I'd seen the cold fury that emerged when he felt challenged or disobeyed, the way he could wield silence and disapproval like weapons, the subtle threats wrapped in loving concern. I worry about how you'd manage without me, Allison. You're not exactly financially savvy. Those words echoed in my mind long after I left the consultation, spoken with feigned affection, but weighted with sharp intent. He'd conditioned me to believe I couldn't function without him, that the outside world was too complex, too cold, too harsh for someone like me. And for so long, I had believed him. Saturday morning, while Marcus was supposedly at a work retreat with Julia, I now realized, I returned home and methodically went through our files, taking photos of financial statements, property documents, tax returns. I located my grandmother's jewelry that Marcus had insisted we keep in the home safe for security. A safe whose combination he'd changed last year without telling me the new one. It took 3 attempts with dates significant to him before I tried his birth year and gained access. I packed several suitcases with clothes and personal items, carefully selecting things he wouldn't immediately notice were missing. I moved like a shadow through the house, afraid even the sound of a zipper or the creak of a floorboard might betray me. Each item I placed in my suitcase felt like a stolen fragment of my own life, pieces I was reclaiming one at a time. As I moved through the house, memories surfaced like air bubbles in still water. Marcus criticizing my cooking in front of dinner guests while they looked embarrassed for me. Marcus explaining my own job to me at a nonprofit fundraiser. Marcus canceling our anniversary dinner because a client called, only to come home smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine. The most disturbing discovery came when I checked his home office computer. Marcus was methodical about password protection, but he also believed I was too technologically inept to pose any threat. The password to his personal laptop was the same one he'd used for years, his college soccer jersey number, followed by his initials. Inside, I found not only explicit emails between him and Julia dating back over 2 years, but also a folder containing detailed records of my spending, my work schedule, even logs of my phone calls and texts that he'd somehow obtained access to. The level of surveillance shocked me, even after years of control. This wasn't just a controlling husband. This was someone who viewed me as property, to be monitored and managed. Among the files was a document titled Prenup Amendment, a draft agreement that would severely limit my claims in case of divorce, which he'd apparently been planning to have me sign on our upcoming anniversary. I forwarded everything to my secure email, then carefully returned the computer to exactly the state I'd found it in. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. Something had crystallized in me. A cold, clear certainty that I would not only leave this marriage, but would do so on my terms. Sunday evening arrived, and I returned home as promised, one suitcase in hand, as if I'd just been on a short trip. Marcus was waiting in the living room, his face set in an expression of practiced concern. "Allison, thank God, I've been so worried." He moved to embrace me, but I stepped back, maintaining distance. Something flickered in his eyes, confusion, then irritation at this unexpected resistance. "We need to talk," I said, setting my suitcase down. "Of course," he replied, gesturing to the sofa. "I ordered your favorite from Bellafina's. Thought we could have a nice dinner and clear the air about whatever's bothering you." My favorite from Bellafina's was chicken marsala, except it had never been. I'd mentioned once, years ago, that it disagreed with my stomach. But Marcus insisted I was mistaken, and had ordered it for me ever since. This small erasure of my preferences suddenly symbolized our entire marriage. "I'm not hungry," I said, remaining standing. "Marcus, I know about Julia." His face remained impassive for approximately 3 seconds, just long enough for him to calculate his best approach. Then came the furrowed brow of confusion. "Julia? My office manager? What about her?" The practiced innocence in his voice made something inside me harden further. "I saw you with her, here, in our bedroom. Thursday afternoon." Another pause, another calculation. Then, "Allison, I don't know what you think you saw, but stop." My voice didn't rise, but it had an edge that made him blink in surprise. "I saw you having sex with Julia in our bed." I stood in the doorway and watched. "So please don't insult what's left of our marriage by lying to me right now." His strategy shifted visibly, the concerned husband facade dropping away to reveal something colder, more calculated. "Fine, it happened once. I made a mistake. I've been under tremendous pressure at work and 2 years," I interrupted. "You've been sleeping with her for 2 years. The trip to Phoenix last March, she was there. The late meetings every Thursday with her. The weekend retreat you're supposedly at right now with her." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "You went through my computer." Not a denial, not even an attempt at one. Just anger that his privacy had been violated, the same privacy he'd systematically denied me for years. "Yes," I admitted. "And I found the monitoring software you installed on my phone, the logs of my calls and texts, the prenup amendment you were planning to surprise me with." His mouth tightened into a thin line. "You had no right." The absurdity of his indignation might have made me laugh if I wasn't so coldly furious. "I want a divorce, Marcus." He didn't look surprised, just calculating. "You're upset?" "Understandably. But divorce is a significant step, Allison. You should think carefully about what that would mean for you, financially, socially." There was the threat, right on cue, wrapped in concern. "I have thought about it," I replied, very carefully. "In fact, I have a proposal for how we move forward." Marcus's eyebrows lifted slightly. This wasn't the script he'd expected. The tearful wife begging for another chance or making emotional demands. This was something new. And I could see it unsettled him. "I'm listening," he said, attempting to reclaim control of the conversation. What I said next would set in motion the events that would lead to that dinner. the one that started with my tears and ended with something very different. But as I looked at my husband of 12 years, I realized I was already seeing him differently. Not as the powerful figure who had dominated my life, but as a small, insecure man whose power existed only because I had given it to him. "Let's have dinner," I said, my voice steady. "Not tonight. Next Friday. There's a restaurant I'd like to go to. We can discuss terms then." Terms. Marcus looked both wary and slightly amused, as if my attempt at negotiation was cute but ultimately futile. "Yes, terms," I repeated. "Oh, and Marcus, I think Julia should join us." His face registered genuine shock for the first time in our conversation. "You can't be serious." I picked up my suitcase, prepared to leave again. Perfectly serious. The three of us. "Next Friday, 7 p.m. I'll text you the details. And if I refuse this unusual request," I met his gaze directly, "then my lawyer contacts you." Monday morning, and things become much less amicable. As I turned to leave, he called after me. "Where are you going?" "This is your home too." I paused at the door. "No, Marcus, it hasn't been my home for a very long time." The look of confused anger on his face as I walked out would once have set me spiraling into apologies and concessions. Now it felt like the first real victory I'd had in years. I spent the next 5 days executing the plan I developed during those quiet hours in Dana's spare bedroom. It wasn't just about leaving Marcus. It was about reclaiming everything he'd taken from me, piece by carefully orchestrated piece. My first stop Monday morning was the bank. I opened a new account at a different institution, transferring a portion of my salary there. Not enough to alert Marcus, but enough to build a financial cushion. The bank manager looked concerned when I explained I needed an account my husband couldn't access. "Ma'am, is everything okay at home?" she asked quietly. The genuine concern in her eyes nearly broke my carefully maintained composure. How long had it been since someone had actually worried about my well-being rather than how my actions might affect them? "It will be," I answered, surprising myself with my certainty. Next, I contacted Marcus's mother, Carol. Despite his controlling nature, Marcus maintained the appearance of being a devoted family man, and his relationship with his widowed mother was something he took pride in. Carol had always been kind to me, if somewhat distant, and I had often suspected she saw more than she let on. Allison, what a lovely surprise. Her voice carried the slight Midwestern accent she'd never lost despite decades in Arizona. "Marcus mentioned you were taking some time away." "Did he happen to mention why?" I asked carefully. A pause. "No, dear, he didn't. But I've raised one man and been married to another. I know when they're not telling the whole truth." That opening was all I needed. I didn't share everything, just enough for her to understand the marriage was ending, and why. I also extended an invitation. "I've arranged a dinner this Friday at Bellafina's. Marcus will be there, and well, there's someone else he's been involved with who will be attending. I'd very much appreciate if you could join us." A confrontation dinner? Carol sounded more intrigued than disapproving. "That doesn't sound like the Allison I know." "I'm not the Allison you know anymore," I replied. "I'm not sure I ever was." As I ended the call, a hot wave of shame crawled up my neck. Was I really inviting people to witness the implosion of my marriage, like it was some twisted show? What if they thought I was vindictive or unhinged? What if they left the dinner thinking Marcus had been right about me all along, that I was dramatic, unstable, impossible to please? The doubts nipped at me like cold rain, even as I forced myself to keep moving. Another pause. Then, what time should I arrive? Similar conversations followed with Marcus's sister, Vanessa, who had always treated me with thinly veiled condescension, mirroring her brother's attitude that I was somehow beneath them intellectually. I also reached out to my own sister, Laya, who'd gradually been pushed to the periphery of my life through Marcus's subtle criticisms and scheduling conflicts. "Jesus, Allison," Laya exclaimed after I explained the situation. "I knew something was off, but I had no idea it was this bad. Why didn't you tell me?" The question stung, because it highlighted how effectively Marcus had isolated me. "He made me believe I was the problem," I admitted, "that my perceptions were wrong, that I was lucky to have him." "That absolute bastard," Laya muttered. "I've always thought there was something off about him, but you seemed so determined to make it work." "Wait, did you say you invited his mistress to this dinner too?" "Yes, bold, potentially messy. I'm absolutely in. The most difficult call was to Marcus's former father-in-law from his first marriage, Charles Morton. Marcus had been married briefly in his mid-20s to Charles's daughter, Camille, a relationship that ended when Camille allegedly cheated. At least that was the story Marcus had always told. They'd maintained a cordial relationship over the years, with Charles occasionally referring clients to Marcus's firm. I'd met Charles only twice at firm events, but remembered him as a dignified older man who treated Marcus with respectful caution. Finding his contact information required some digging, and I wasn't sure he'd even remember me. "Miss Parker?" "Yes, of course I remember you," Marcus's wife. His voice was formal, but not unfriendly. "What can I do for you?" When I explained my situation and asked if he would attend the dinner, there was a long silence on the line. "You know, Miss Parker, Camille never cheated on Marcus." The words hung in the air between us, confirming a suspicion I'd harbored for years. "I didn't think she had," I replied softly. "She left because of behaviors very similar to what you're describing. The control, the gaslighting, the isolation. I watched my daughter disappear into that marriage and was thankful every day when she found the strength to leave it." Another pause. "I'll be at your dinner, Miss Parker, and I'll bring the documentation we gathered during their divorce, that Marcus was so eager to have sealed by the court." The final piece involved Julia herself. I briefly considered confronting her directly, but decided on a different approach. Through Dana's network at the clinic, I located a nurse who had previously worked with Julia's mother. A few discreet questions revealed that Mrs. Morgan was extremely traditional and had been loudly proud of her daughter's recent promotion at a prestigious consulting firm. A promotion I now understood had likely been influenced by her relationship with Marcus. I sent a formal invitation to Mrs. Morgan, explaining that the firm was hosting a special dinner to recognize Julia's contributions and that family members were welcome. I knew it was manipulative, but after discovering the extent of Marcus and Julia's deception, not just the affair, but the way they'd laughed about me in their emails, calling me the obedient wife and joking about how oblivious I was, my capacity for guilt had significantly diminished. I felt a strange calm wash over me as I drafted the invitation. It was the first time in years that I was acting not out of fear, but with intention. No longer was I running from confrontation, I was orchestrating it. The restaurant Bellafina was selected with purpose. It was upscale enough that Marcus wouldn't balk at the location, private enough to avoid immediate public scandal, and, most importantly, owned by the brother of a patient whose insurance appeal I'd personally fought for last year. Xavier Lucen had offered me a standing, "anything you need," after I secured coverage for his brother's experimental treatment. I was finally collecting a private room for 12. Absolute discretion. "And I'll need control over the seating arrangement," I explained to Xavier over the phone. "Consider it done," he replied without hesitation. "And Allison, whatever this is about, good luck." By Thursday, all the pieces were in place. Marcus had reluctantly agreed to the dinner, clearly believing it was some misguided attempt at public reconciliation, or perhaps a purposely uncomfortable but ultimately brief meeting before proceeding with a quiet divorce. Julia had also confirmed, likely expecting an emotional confrontation she could weather with Marcus's support before they continued their relationship openly. Neither had any idea who else would be attending, or what evidence I had prepared to share. But as the evening neared, I realized the power in my preparation wasn't just in the documents. It was in the transformation I felt. I wasn't the frightened wife hiding in the shadows. I was the architect of my own defense. Each folder, each name on the guest list was a testament to the years I had reclaimed piece by piece. The night before the dinner, I sat in Dana's apartment reviewing the folders I'd prepared. One contained financial records showing how Marcus had systematically diverted joint funds into accounts under his name only. Another held the surveillance logs he'd kept of my activities. A third contained the explicit communications between him and Julia, including messages planning their future after I was out of the picture. Most damning was the folder Charles had provided. Court transcripts from Marcus's first divorce, showing a pattern of emotional abuse and control that mirrored my own experience with chilling accuracy. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Dana asked, watching me organize the materials. It's going to be incredibly intense. I looked up from the papers, feeling strangely calm. I spent 12 years being afraid of his reactions, his judgment, his disapproval. I'm not afraid anymore. Still, a public confrontation? It's not about public humiliation. I explained, though that would certainly be a side effect. It's about making it impossible for him to control the narrative. If I confronted him privately, he'd twist everything, make me doubt myself again, and then tell everyone his version of events. This way, everything is witnessed. Everything is out in the open. Dana nodded slowly. Just be prepared for him to fight back. Men like Marcus don't go down easily. I know, I said, closing the last folder. That's what I'm counting on. Friday evening arrived with a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. I dressed carefully in a deep blue dress I'd purchased for the occasion. Not one Marcus had selected or approved. I styled my hair the way I preferred, not the way he insisted suited me better. I even wore the red lipstick he'd always claimed was too harsh for my complexion. As I applied the final touches, I caught my reflection in the mirror and paused. The woman looking back at me wasn't the frightened, diminished person I'd been 2 weeks ago. There was strength in her eyes, determination in the set of her shoulders. I barely recognized myself, yet I felt more genuine than I had in 12 years. I arrived at Bellafina 30 minutes early to ensure everything was arranged properly. Xavier greeted me personally, leading me to the private dining room where a horseshoe-shaped table was set up exactly as I'd requested. The guests will be directed here as they arrive, he explained. And I've instructed the staff about the serving schedule you requested. Thank you, Xavier. I placed my folders at my seat at the center of the horseshoe. One more thing, regardless of how this evening goes, no one is to be asked to leave unless I specifically request it. He nodded, understanding the implication. It's your show, Allison. We'll follow your lead. I took my seat and waited, my stomach churning with a mixture of anxiety and resolve. The first to arrive, surprisingly, was Charles Morton, dignified in a tailored suit, carrying a leather portfolio. Miss Parker, he greeted me formally. May I call you Allison now that we're conspirators of a sort? Allison, please, I replied, managing a small smile. Thank you for coming, Mr. Morton. Charles, he corrected, taking the seat I indicated, and I wouldn't have missed this for the world. Marcus has had this coming for a very long time. Others began to arrive. Laia with her husband, Carol looking elegant and curious, Vanessa and her husband appearing confused by the growing assembly, Dana sporting a fierce grin of anticipation. Mrs. Morgan arrived looking proud and slightly bewildered, clearly expecting a very different kind of evening. At precisely 7 p.m., Marcus entered, his lawyer's smile freezing when he saw the assembled group behind him. Julia stopped short, her eyes darting from face to face with growing alarm. Allison, Marcus's voice was tightly controlled as he approached me. What exactly is going on here? I met his gaze steadily. Exactly what I said, Marcus. Dinner. To discuss terms. Please, take your seat. You too, Julia. We're just about to begin. As they reluctantly sat in the only remaining seats directly across from me, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The stage was set, the audience was assembled, and for the first time in 12 years, I was the one in control of the story. Thank you all for coming, I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. Some of you received specific invitations. Others, I glanced at Marcus and Julia, maybe surprised by the guest list. Marcus's face had settled into the cold, impassive expression I recognized as his courtroom mask. Julia looked like she wanted to disappear through the floor, especially when she spotted her mother across the table. Mrs. Morgan was already frowning in confusion, looking between her daughter and Marcus with narrowing eyes. Before we order, I want to be transparent about why I've gathered you all here. 2 weeks ago, I discovered that my husband of 12 years has been having an affair with his office manager, Julia, for the past 2 years. A collective intake of breath swept around the table. Vanessa's hand flew to her mouth while Carol's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Morgan turned to her daughter with naked shock on her face. Julia Marie Morgan. Tell me this isn't true. Before Julia could respond, Marcus interjected smoothly. This is hardly the appropriate venue for airing personal grievances, Allison. If you wanted to discuss our marriage, we could have done so privately. His voice had that familiar, reasonable tone that had so often made me question my own judgment. But not tonight. Privacy has been your greatest weapon, Marcus, I replied calmly. Behind closed doors, you've been free to manipulate, control, and gaslight me for 12 years. Tonight, we're going to have an honest conversation. With witnesses. I opened the first folder and passed copies of its contents around the table. Let's start with the financial situation. Marcus has systematically diverted funds from our joint accounts into private accounts under his name only. He's removed my name from property documents we both paid for, including our home, and he's been preparing documents to significantly reduce my claim to our marital assets in the event of divorce. Marcus's attorney's mask slipped, replaced by a flash of genuine anger. These are private financial matters that show a clear pattern of financial abuse, Charles Morton interrupted, speaking for the first time. A pattern I recognize all too well from your first marriage, Marcus. Marcus's head whipped toward Charles. What the hell are you doing here? Supporting Allison, Charles replied evenly. Just as I wish someone had supported Camille when she was married to you. I nodded gratefully to Charles before continuing. Next, I'd like to address the matter of surveillance. I distributed the second folder. Marcus has been monitoring my calls, texts, and movements for at least the past 3 years. He's kept detailed logs of my activities, my conversations, my spending habits. I've included screenshots from his computer proving he installed spyware on my devices, without my knowledge or consent. Laia made an audible noise of disgust as she flipped through the pages. This is seriously disturbing, Marcus. You realize this is illegal, right? Marcus's jaw tightened. Allison, enough. You're embarrassing yourself. No, Marcus. For the first time in 12 years, I'm standing up for myself. And we're just getting started. The server chose that moment to appear, looking uncertain about interrupting the tense scene. I nodded encouragingly. Please, let's order. This conversation will continue over dinner. The awkward process of ordering food provided a brief respite from the tension, though no one seemed particularly interested in the menu. I noticed Carol watching her son with an expression I couldn't quite read, while Mrs. Morgan was whispering furiously to Julia, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Once the server departed, I continued. Now, regarding the affair. I slid the third folder across the table directly to Julia and Marcus. These are printouts of your emails, text messages, and hotel receipts from the past 2 years. I've been selective about which ones to share with the group, but you might want to review what I've included. As they frantically flipped through the pages, their faces drained of color. I'd included enough explicit content to make it undeniable, but had carefully chosen messages that revealed the truth of their relationship without being unnecessarily graphic. There are several messages where you both discuss me. I continued. Particularly interesting are the ones where you joke about how oblivious I am, where you call me the obedient wife, where you plan weekends together while Marcus tells me he's at business conferences. Julia looked up, actual tears in her eyes. For a brief moment, I saw sheer panic and shame flash across her face, a look that told me she was realizing not only what she'd done, but how exposed she was now. That tiny flicker of fear in her eyes ignited something fierce inside me. A quiet, fierce certainty that I was no longer the one on the defensive. It was the same look I'd seen in the mirror too many nights, grappling with disbelief, denial, and guilt. But now that it belonged to her, something shifted in me. I wasn't weak. I wasn't alone. I had facts, evidence, and a room full of people who could no longer pretend ignorance. Allison, I cut her off. Don't pretend you didn't know he was married. Don't pretend you had any concern for me as a person. Your messages make it very clear how you both viewed me. Marcus finally broke his silence, his voice low and dangerous. Is this your idea of negotiating divorce terms? Public humiliation? Because I can promise you, if you pursue this vindictive path, you will regret it. Financially. He still believed he could intimidate me into silence, as if his threats still held power. But I wasn't that woman anymore. Charles Morton cleared his throat. That brings us rather neatly to my contribution. He opened his portfolio and extracted several official-looking documents. These are the sealed records from your divorce proceedings with Camille. The judge allowed them to be sealed as part of the settlement, but as the father of the plaintiff, I retained copies. Marcus's face went from angry red to ashen in seconds. Those records are sealed by court order. You can't legally— I'm not publishing them, Charles interrupted. I'm showing them to a small group of concerned individuals in a private setting. There's case law to support this being perfectly legal, as your lawyer could confirm. Marcus's sister, Vanessa, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. What exactly is in those records? Charles met her gaze steadily. Documentation of emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and surveillance. A pattern remarkably similar to what Allison has just described. Your brother didn't tell you why his first marriage really ended, did he? He preferred the narrative that Camille cheated, when in reality, she fled a controlling, psychologically abusive relationship. I watched as the realization dawned on Vanessa's face. Then Carol's. Marcus had maintained the facade of being the wronged party in his first marriage for so long that even his family had believed it. Marcus, is this true? Carol asked, her voice uncharacteristically small. Before he could answer, the first course arrived, creating another awkward pause in the confrontation. I noticed Mrs. Morgan was now sitting ramrod straight, her expression thunderous as she stared at her daughter. I think we could all use a moment to process, I suggested, as the servers placed salads before each stunned guest. Please, let's eat. The absurdity of politely consuming salad in the midst of such a dramatic revelation might have been comical in other circumstances. I managed a few bites, more to maintain the rhythm of the dinner than from any actual appetite. Marcus hadn't touched his food, instead leaning close to whisper furiously to Julia, who kept shaking her head slightly. When the servers had cleared the first course, he finally addressed the table. I don't know what Allison has told you all, but clearly she's suffering some kind of breakdown. Yes, I admit I had an indiscretion with Julia. It was a mistake, and one I deeply regret. But these wild accusations of abuse and control are the desperate attempts of a woman afraid of losing her comfortable lifestyle. The smooth, reasonable tone was back, the voice that had made me doubt myself countless times. But it didn't work on Laya. Cut the crap, Marcus, my sister snapped. I've watched you systematically isolate Allison for years. Every time I tried to make plans with my sister, you had some reason why it wasn't convenient. Every friend she had, you found some fault with. Every opinion she expressed that didn't align with yours, you undermined. Don't you dare pretend this is about her comfortable lifestyle. Marcus's eyes narrowed. You always were disproportionately protective, Laya. Allison is a grown woman, capable of making her own choices, except when those choices didn't align with what you wanted, I interjected. Then suddenly I was being difficult, or not thinking clearly, or overreacting. The main course arrived, creating another brief interruption. I noticed that several guests had barely touched their food, too engrossed in the unfolding drama. Mrs. Morgan was now openly glaring at Marcus rather than her daughter, suggesting the tide of her anger had turned. Once the servers departed, I continued, more confident now. I didn't bring you all here just to expose Marcus's behavior or embarrass Julia, though they certainly deserve it. I brought you here because I'm ending my marriage, and I wanted witnesses, to ensure Marcus can't control the narrative as he did after his marriage to Camille. I turned to address Marcus directly. Here are my terms. You will agree to an equitable division of assets, including restoring my name to the deed of the house, which I intend to sell. You will cease all surveillance of my activities immediately. You will not contest the divorce on any grounds, and you will provide a written statement acknowledging the affair for the divorce proceedings. Marcus's laugh was cold and dismissive. For what, Allison? You'll show these documents to more family members? Go ahead. When this emotional spectacle is over, we'll still end up negotiating through lawyers. And I guarantee mine are better than whatever discount attorney your clinic salary can afford. It was the opening I'd been waiting for. Actually, Marcus, my discount attorney is Malcolm Reinhardt. The name had exactly the effect I'd hoped. Malcolm Reinhardt was one of the most feared divorce attorneys in Phoenix, known for his ruthless approach to exposing hidden assets and his perfect record in cases involving infidelity. You can't afford Reinhardt, Marcus said, but I heard the first note of uncertainty in his voice. Actually, she can. Dana spoke up. The hospital board was very interested in her evidence regarding a certain client of your firm who received preferential treatment in our transplant program last year. All coordinated through Julia's position, bypassing standard protocols. They've agreed to cover Allison's legal expenses as part of their internal investigation. This was a direct hit at both Marcus and Julia. The transplant case had been one of Marcus's major victories, securing a heart for the son of a wealthy client by navigating what he'd called bureaucratic obstacles. I had always suspected impropriety, but could never prove it, until I found the emails between him and Julia discussing how they had manipulated the priority list. Julia went completely pale. That wasn't. We were helping a dying child by potentially condemning another patient who was higher on the list based on medical criteria, Dana replied coldly. The hospital takes its transplant protocols very seriously, as I'm sure the Medical Ethics Board will explain during their review. The implications hung in the air. Marcus's professional reputation and Julia's career, both potentially at stake. This is blackmail, Marcus hissed. No, I corrected him. This is consequence, something you've managed to avoid for far too long. I turned to address the entire table. I apologize for involving you all in what should have been a private matter. But after 12 years of privacy being used as a weapon against me, I needed witnesses. I needed people to know the truth, not just about the affair, but about who Marcus really is behind the successful consultant facade. Mrs. Morgan suddenly stood up, her napkin falling forgotten to the floor. Julia, we're leaving. Now. She turned to me, her expression a complex mixture of anger, embarrassment, and reluctant respect. Miss Parker, I don't know what to say, except that I didn't raise my daughter to be the other woman. Her voice trembled, equal parts fury and heartbreak. She clutched her purse tightly, her movements sharp and decisive, as though distancing herself physically might somehow cleanse her emotionally from the scene unfolding before her. As they departed, Julia cast one desperate glance back at Marcus, who didn't even look at her. His focus was entirely on me, his expression cold, but with something new in it that I'd rarely seen directed at me: respect. However grudging. You've orchestrated quite a show, Allison, he said quietly. I underestimated you. Yes, I agreed simply. You did. Dessert was served in an atmosphere of stunned silence. Marcus had excused himself shortly after Julia and her mother left, murmuring something about needing to make calls. He hadn't outright agreed to my terms, but the careful way he'd extracted himself, without threats or bluster, told me everything I needed to know. For perhaps the first time in our marriage, I had the upper hand. And the silence he left behind wasn't empty. It was full of realization, of truth too heavy to ignore. And he knew it. The remaining guests picked at their crème brûlée and chocolate torte, exchanging awkward glances. Carol finally broke the silence, addressing me directly across the table. I always sensed something wasn't right, she admitted, her southern accent more pronounced with emotion. The way Marcus spoke about you, the way you seemed to diminish when he entered a room. I should have said something. I shook my head gently. He wouldn't have let you see enough to be certain. He was too careful for that. Still, she persisted. A mother knows, or should know. She straightened her shoulders with unexpected resolve. I want you to understand, Allison, that I will not take his side in this. What you've shown us tonight, it changes everything. Vanessa nodded in agreement, though she looked shaken. I had no idea about Camille. He always made it sound like, God, I've been awful to you sometimes, haven't I? Believing his version of everything. He's very convincing, I offered, not quite ready to absolve her completely, but acknowledging the complexity of the situation. Charles Morton cleared his throat. If I might make a suggestion, Allison. When Marcus returns, and he will once he's composed himself and formulated a strategy, don't engage further tonight. You've made your position clear, presented your evidence, and stated your terms. My experience with Marcus suggests he'll try to separate you from your supporters and regain control of the narrative. I agree, Laya said firmly. You've done what you came to do, masterfully, I might add. Her proud smile warmed something in me that had been cold for too long. True to Charles's prediction, Marcus returned about 20 minutes later, his composure restored and a conciliatory expression carefully arranged on his face. Allison, I think we should continue this conversation privately, he began, standing beside the table rather than retaking his seat. Family dinner may not have been the best venue to address these issues. Actually, I think it was the perfect venue, I replied calmly. But you're right about one thing, we've said what needed to be said tonight. The rest can happen through our attorneys. A flash of irritation crossed his features before he masked it. You've always been emotional, Allison. It's understandable given the circumstances, but escalating to Reinhardt immediately seems unnecessarily adversarial. The surveillance of my activities was unnecessarily adversarial, Marcus. The diversion of joint funds was unnecessarily adversarial. The 2-year affair with your office manager was unnecessarily adversarial. I maintained eye contact, refusing to be the first to look away. I'm simply responding appropriately. I stood, gathering my folders. Thank you all for coming. Dinner has been paid for, including dessert, coffee, and drinks. If anyone would like to stay longer, I'll be leaving now. Marcus stepped toward me, lowering his voice. This isn't over, Allison. You're right, I agreed, meeting his gaze steadily. The divorce proceedings haven't even started yet. As I moved to leave, Carol surprised everyone by standing and embracing me. I'm so sorry, dear, she whispered, and so proud of you for finding your strength. Laia stood next, as did Dana, creating a protective formation around me as we moved toward the exit. Charles Morton fell into step alongside us, his presence adding a distinguished authority to our departure. Quite a remarkable woman you married, Marcus, Charles commented over his shoulder. Pity you never appreciated that, until it was too late. The cool evening air hit my face as we stepped outside, and I took my first deep, unrestrained breath in what felt like years. My legs were trembling from the sustained tension, but I felt lighter than I had in memory. You did it, Laia said, squeezing my hand. I can't believe you actually pulled that off. Neither can I admitted, but it's just the beginning. That night was 3 years ago. The divorce was finalized 11 months later, and while it wasn't entirely smooth, Marcus fought the financial settlement, until Malcolm Reinhardt presented evidence of hidden assets that could have triggered an IRS investigation. I ultimately received what I demanded that night at Bella Vista. The house was sold, and I used my portion to purchase a waterfront condo I'd chosen entirely on my own. The hospital ethics investigation into the transplant irregularity resulted in a formal censure for Marcus's firm and Julia's termination. Their relationship didn't survive. The professional fallout was swift. Last I heard, she'd moved to Chicago and was working in pharmaceutical sales. Marcus's career took a significant hit when several clients, including some referred by Charles Morton, took their business elsewhere. His carefully curated reputation for integrity couldn't withstand the behind-the-scenes revelations that circulated through Phoenix's close-knit professional community. He wasn't disbarred, but his partnership track stalled indefinitely. As for me, I was promoted to Director of Patient Advocacy at the hospital last year, a position I might never have pursued while with Marcus, who had always subtly discouraged my career advancement as unnecessary stress. I reconnected with friends who had drifted away during my marriage and formed new relationships without continuously filtering them through someone else's approval. Dana recently teased me about having dinner with an orthopedic surgeon who joined the hospital staff 6 months ago. Look at you, building a life instead of hiding in one, she said. I'm not sure where that relationship will go, but for the first time in decades, I'm making that decision based solely on my own feelings. Sometimes I still wake up disoriented, momentarily expecting to hear Marcus's voice, telling me I've slept too late or haven't prepared breakfast properly. The programming of 12 years doesn't disappear overnight. But those moments come less frequently, and when they do, instead of spiraling into panic or self-doubt, I close my eyes and remind myself of the night I stood up for myself, in front of everyone who mattered, and even those who didn't. I remind myself of the strength I found when I thought I had none left, of the quiet power that settled in my bones as I watched him realize he could no longer control me. The night that started with my tears ended with something I hadn't fully experienced in my adult life. Freedom. Not just from Marcus, but from the doubts he had systematically planted in my mind about my own worth, my own perceptions, my own right to exist as an autonomous person. That dinner at Bella Vista, with its precisely arranged seating chart and carefully timed revelations, was theatrical, perhaps even manipulative in its own way. But after 12 years of being manipulated in the shadows, I needed to bring everything into the light, where Marcus couldn't twist it, minimize it, or make me doubt what I knew to be true. People sometimes ask if I regret the public nature of the confrontation, if I wouldn't have preferred a more private resolution. I understand the question, but they don't understand what privacy meant in my marriage. Privacy was where Marcus thrived, where his control was absolute. The most healing thing I could do was to throw open all the windows and doors and let the fresh air in. So no, I don't regret the tears I shed that night. They were the last tears Marcus would ever extract from me. And the dinner that began with those tears ended with the first steps toward reclaiming myself, a journey that continues, imperfectly but joyfully, every day. Dear friend, if there's one thing I've learned from this journey, it's that the walls we think protect us can just as easily become cages. The Stoics taught that while we can't control what happens around us, we can control how we respond, and that choosing courage over fear is an act of profound freedom. Tonight, I want you to remember, the strongest thing you can do is stand in your truth, even when your voice shakes. The hardest part is taking that first step, but once you do, every breath after feels lighter. You are braver than the doubts whispering in your mind, and your worth has never depended on someone else's approval. Live in the light you create for yourself. So the story's over. Our wonderful friends, are you still here at this hour? If you are, then I know something in this journey touched you in some way. Maybe you saw yourself in Allison's quiet strength, in her years of self-doubt, or in her fierce determination to reclaim her voice. And maybe, just maybe, you're standing at your own crossroads, wondering whether it's too late to choose yourself. Let me tell you, it's never too late. This wasn't just a story about betrayal or revenge, it was about awakening. About remembering your worth when someone has spent years trying to make you forget it. About finding your voice, even when it trembles, and using it to tell your truth out loud, no matter who's listening. The great Stoic philosopher Epictetus once said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." Allison didn't just break free from her marriage, she broke free from the mental cage that told her she wasn't enough. And that's a lesson for all of us. We live in a world that often praises silent endurance, but there is power in standing up and saying, "This is not okay." Power in knowing your boundaries. Power in choosing peace over pleasing. So tonight, if something stirred in you, sit with it. Ask yourself, where have I been silenced? Where have I dimmed my light for someone else's comfort? And when you're ready, take that first step. Even if it's small, even if it's scary, because the air is lighter on the other side of fear. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that they're not alone, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue sharing these raw, real, and powerful stories of resilience. You matter. Your story matters, and your healing begins the moment you believe you're worthy of it.